Take a look at this picture. Imagine now being stuck here forever. No matter where you move to or how much you panic, the world would just stay the same. How would you feel? What would be running through your mind? Purgatory is what I think of. A transitional state, a rite of passage where individuals hang isolated as they move between stages of their journey. Now take a look at this picture. It's one I'm sure you've seen before. What is it that connects pictures like this to this, or even this? The word liminal comes from the Latin word limen, which means threshold. It's usually used to explain the feeling one gets during uncertain periods of time, often when moving from where you've been to where you're going. I've heard many people refer to this in different contexts: the lonely period, a rite of passage, or the beauty of dead worlds. And it's usually applied to stages of life, for good reason. But in the last few years, the term has taken on a new physical meaning, now used to describe pools or staircases or just empty spaces in general. See, this resonates because what all of the pictures I just showed you have in common is a feeling, a universal unsettlingness that makes one question. And what I want to understand is why. Rites of passage take many different forms and can be found throughout every corner of the world, from initiations to rituals, coming-of-age ceremonies to commencements. These events mark a turning point in one's life, usually because of some sort of change. Universally, rites of passages have three common steps: the separation phase, where one moves away from the familiar; the liminal period, where one outgrows their previous surroundings but is not yet developed enough to be reintegrated; and finally, the reintegration phase, where individuals then emerge with a new identity or purpose. But among these steps, the liminal phase is often the most crucial. It's a time of testing, of learning, and of growth. It's a process of stripping away old patterns to recreate new ones, usually by facing fears. In indigenous cultures, initiation rituals often involve enduring extreme pain or suffering through isolation. The Maasai of Kenya undergo the Unodo ceremony, where boys have to face rigorous testing in order to become warriors. And in ancient Sparta, a rite of passage in the form of the yagage was used as a test of will, before those who succeeded could then join the military force. In each of these situations, adolescent individuals are involuntarily forced into periods of liminality, where, in overcoming, they prove themselves to be worthy of reintegration. But the key word here is involuntarily. Exposure to the unknown will force growth. It has rewards. I think this is the main reason why we're attracted to it. But there's a big difference between being prepared to venture into the unknown and being unprepared. Involuntary rites of passage, like those of the Maasai and Spartans, were probably necessary, primarily so that these individuals can acquire the growth needed to fulfill their roles in the community. But involuntarily exposing oneself to these rites of passages has a huge cost, and that primarily stems from a lack of being prepared. In ancient Sparta, for example, many of these individuals died during the 3-day rite of passage quests, and for those who survived but failed, an identity crisis was the outcome, where successful reintegration never took place. Liminal spaces can be thought of as a state of psychological limbo. It is dangerous, both from a physical and psychological standpoint. And so if you choose to venture through liminal space, it should be done voluntarily. See, there's something interesting that happens when we choose to confront challenges. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi has a concept called flow state. It's a form of mastery that emerges when one is prepared for the challenges that lie ahead, taking shape in the form of exploratory mechanisms that cultivate a readiness, essentially optimizing ourselves for growth, shifting one from a state of fear to a state of exploration. Voluntarily approaching a rite of passage or an obstacle doesn't mean success is guaranteed, but what it does mean is our biology can be primed to help us. Flow state is intimately tied to something called neuroplasticity. It's one of the fundamental building blocks of growth, and is the process of the brain reorganizing itself in order to form new neural connections. When we successfully move through a challenge, our brains will adapt in response, ultimately resulting in the capacity for us to handle future situations better. But unfortunately, this applies all the time. And so while the positive is that it can make us better at skills, the downside is that it can actively work against us during periods of prolonged stress or trauma. And this is why involuntarily moving through some type of rite of passage can be so harmful. I want to be clear that undergoing any kind of challenge, regardless of whether it was by your own doing, can lead to growth. But the problem is that when forced into these positions involuntarily, both stress and survival mechanisms will revert us into prey-like states, resulting in adaptive changes in the structure of the brain. And this is actually where PTSD comes from, prolonged exposure to a threatening stress response. But the thing is, There will be moments in our lives when we will be forced into a metaphorical rite of passage. And when this happens, sometimes we can't prepare for it, whether we want to or not. I don't think it's a coincidence, for example, that liminal spaces in general became popular in the last 4 years. COVID was an era of extreme uncertainty, where many of us were thrust into unfamiliar territory involuntarily. And I think this collective experience of anxiety that came from the pandemic is mainly what contributed to the rise in popularity of liminal spaces. Throughout your life, there will be periods of immense change. Sometimes this will be ceremonial, such as when graduating college or choosing to move. But other times it won't, such as when losing a job or losing friends or a sudden breakup. During these times, more than just a fear of uncertainty, the unsettling element stems from feeling like we don't have the emotional resources to cope. This is ubiquitous in change, and it's because the point we've been at and the point we're going to are not the same. I think it's really interesting how the physical layout of liminal spaces have this built into them. The back rooms are a hallway where other people are often seen, a physical space used to move from one room to another. It's familiar, but because it's entirely empty, it becomes unsettling. Pools are a place I'm sure everyone has been to at some point in time. It's a place where people often congregate, so it's familiar. But the pool rooms are empty, and as a result, unfamiliar. This is exactly what change feels like. It's both familiar and unfamiliar. You're leaving the past for a better future. But because the unknown is at play, there will always be a universal unsettlingness, a fear that will remain until the new territory becomes mastered, and eventually familiar. This is where the concept of liminal spaces holds its significance. It's a process where self-transformation occurs. Jung, who I seem to be talking about a lot lately, thought of liminality as a threshold between the conscious and the unconscious, where new ideas, insights, and possibilities could be explored. But in this process, a confrontation with the underworld is necessary, something that he himself had firsthand experience with. The Red Book was the outcome of his metaphorical confrontation, a ridiculous piece of work consisting of over 600 pages that makes it look like a collection of medieval manuscripts, all about liminal spaces. He basically obsesses over stories in this book and even stated as much when discussing Dante's Commedia. His interest, however, lies not in the literary work, but rather in seeing these stories as vehicles for meditative exploration. And it's why he continually circulates back to this theme of hell, not as an afterlife, but as a metaphor for psychological change, a state one embodies where they are forced to confront the darker aspects of themselves, when many are not yet capable. Transformation often requires sacrifice, not only by letting go of the parts of ourselves that are no longer useful, but also by building up new parts that can help us in new ways. And so what he suggests is that hell itself is the intermediate state, one that we must go through to change, a place where dangers lurk, an experience we can get lost in and possibly never recover from, which is why most people don't approach change voluntarily. But it's also the only possible method for self-transformation and reaching greater personal heights. All this is to say that the idea of liminal spaces and Jung's concept of hell are the same. They are mirror reflections of each other. And I think this is why liminal spaces resonate. Both of these ideas are extensions of the Rite of Passages. Anytime something is universal, I think it needs to be studied. It suggests a deep fundamental need for its existence, otherwise it wouldn't be universal. When it comes to these three concepts, I can see how they tie into consciousness, although at this point what I'm about to say is pure speculation. David Hume was the first philosopher to propose something called the bundle theory. To simplify it, it basically suggests the self is not a single unchanging entity, but rather a collection of experiences that constantly renew over time. If that's what consciousness is, then it equates to growth, to self-transformation. Natural selection is also a process that can be thought of as a form of transformation, although it is a more cutthroat version. If the organisms don't adapt, they will die, so it's involuntary. But humans are in a peculiar position because many different things influence our genomes. On one hand, genetic changes in the form of natural or sexual selection push us into adaptive advantages. But on the other hand, group or cultural selection can be just as powerful of a driving force. And so what I'm trying to say is that if consciousness evolved due to the advantages awareness provides, and consciousness itself is something that rapidly grows depending on our experiences, what if rites of passages or the concept of Jung's hell are built off this idea, used to force individuals into changes that are beneficial by increasing their consciousness through awareness of what they're capable of? One way of viewing the selection pressures that shaped humanity was as a method for making us more capable. But since life itself is so arbitrary, and the only thing we can be sure of is change, rites of passages could serve the function of preparing us for these changes. putting people through something hard that will force growth in a way that isn't as costly if they fail. I mean, at this point, it's not like I'm saying anything new. Rites of Passages are tests to measure the ability of those who participate, preparing them for the unexpected challenges life will inevitably throw their way. But I think it's funny how this aligns with our biology. Both neuroplasticity and epigenetics are influenced by our environment. But while neuroplasticity is used for learning, epigenetics involves how genes are expressed, with modifications such as methylation turning genes on or off in response to environmental influences. This probably evolved for a more dynamic response to sudden changes, because while genetic shifts occur slowly over generations, epigenetic modifications happen quickly and can alter the trajectory of our lives. There's a really interesting research paper I read on how epigenetics influences consciousness, and in particular, there's one point that I spent a lot of time thinking about. Consciousness is stronger than medication. There are lots of studies that explain the relationship between our thoughts or feelings and the state of our health, and many more that showcase how our habits, what we eat, or how much we exercise can affect health outcomes overall. And so maybe there's something to be said about how important voluntary hardships truly are, about how the changes they create in our epigenome are a continuation of Hume's theory of consciousness, a way of translating consciousness into the genome in a way that will determine what we become. But why do these liminal spaces and the periods of transformation they represent have such a grip on us? Well, my theory is because in a single image, they mirror the continual transformation that is at the heart of consciousness itself. And so the unsettling feeling we get from liminal spaces, whether physical or metaphorical, reflects our inherent awareness of change, the potential it has for growth, and the danger that comes with it. A symbol of the sacrifices that need to be made, but also the new opportunities that can be found, all of which occur when voluntarily approaching change.